Hello, AP students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for part 3 of chapter 1, The Introduction and History of Psychology. So, find your handout and let's talk a little bit about the historical roots. We're going to start with the Stone Age, and I have to admit, there really isn't a lot of recorded information about the Stone Age. It's mostly about the artifacts. But what we do know is that archaeologists, for the most part, have found evidence that people from that period of time might have used something known as trephination. So, what, pray tell, is trephination? This is trephination. This idea that humans of that era of time would carve holes through the skulls to release perhaps maybe evil spirits. This might have been a way to treat individuals who today probably would have been diagnosed with maybe schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. So, nevertheless, trephination certainly was kind of a unique style of treatment. Aside from that, we've got to get into what the Greeks were doing. And the first thing I want to talk a little bit about is this concept of dualism. Dualism kind of refers to the division of the world, and that all things are basically placed into two parts. So you could talk about body and spirit, but you could also talk about good and evil. And not only were the Greeks looking at this, but you could probably go throughout world history of that era of time, and you could probably find a lot of evidence of this, even within certain cultures outside of the Mediterranean. So we're going to talk a little bit about Plato and Aristotle. And a lot of people believe that the Greeks, for the most part, had a view of human behavior that was a little oversimplified. We're going to kind of skip over Socrates. But we're going to talk about Plato. And the reason why we're going to focus on him is that he was really one of the first philosophers credited with the study of gaining knowledge, this desire or quest for knowledge and understanding. For the most part, he really wanted to have perfect knowledge. And he talked a little bit about this concept of cognition, this idea of thinking. And so, in a way, he kind of is like the first cognitive psychologist. Aristotle, who happened to be a student of Plato, developed a lot of different theories. He talked a little bit about sensation, how the senses are kind of brought into understanding how we perceive as far as perception, cognition again with thinking. He talked about memory. He also talked about problem solving, but he also talked about a subject that is probably near and dear to a lot of scientists today, and that is the concept of ethics. His approach to learning really defined science until the advent of the empirical age or the 17th century. When we talk about other things that came out of ancient Greece, you could talk about Hippocrates and this idea that we could talk about how emotions kind of come from some of our different bodily fluids and such. All of that probably would be thrown into this. All right, let's talk about Asia. About the same time that we're talking about Aristotle and Plato and such, in the Far East, you had kind of the rise of Buddhism. And for the most part, people were exploring their consciousness or their level of awareness. And really, a good portion of our Eastern Europe or Eastern Asian religions are kind of based on this idea of being aware and controlling consciousness through the process of meditation, or even going as far as when we talk about the Hindus, talking about things like yoga. So in a way, this is maybe kind of touching into this concept of being aware of our cognitions and our senses and such. During the medieval ages, and the rise of the power of the Catholic Church. Uh, Mind and soul, we're kind of seeing is operating outside of the natural laws that govern the worldly objects and events. In a way, the mind is a mystery. That was certainly a key. Clergy sought to, you know, basically help us understand, the mystery of, the soul and such through faith. When we get into the 17th century, we're kind of entering into the age of reason and scientific revolutions and such. So we're going to talk about Rene Descartes, and for the most part, he asserted that human sensation and behavior are all based on the activity in the nervous system, which is kind of cool because he's talking about the power of the nerve itself, the neuron, and he believed that the physical world is not under divine influence, but observable laws, meaning that there are really, in his mind, testable and observable things that can help us understand the world that we live in. John Locke was also an empiricalist. He kind of believed in empiricalism, this idea that truth through observation and experiences. And he talked about, in one of his essays, this concept of tabula rasa, which is this idea that, our mind when we're a child is like a blank slate, meaning that for the most part, all the knowledge that we have had to be learned for the most part. I mean, granted, there are a few things that are innate, but for the most part, knowledge is derived from some kind of experience, is really what this is all about. And then along that line, you got to talk about Thomas Hobbes. Even though Hobbes came before Locke, he believed in this concept of materialism, the belief that matter and energy are the only things that exist. Consciousness is a byproduct of the machinery of the brain. He believed that philosophy, at least in this form, would be greatly influenced by behavior. All right, let's talk about the core concepts, the 5 viewpoints of psychology. And these are kind of like the early areas of kind of where psychology kind of stems from. Structuralism, for the most part, is a school of psychology devoted to uncovering the basic structures that make up the mind and thought. And some of the founders and contributors to this would be Charles Darwin, who suggested a biological kinship between humans and animals. He talked a lot about evolution for the most part. Along that line, you got to talk about the father of psychology, Wilhelm Wundt. He designed basically an experiment to measure the lag between hearing a bell and responding to it. And then finally, his protege, E.B. Teichner, who talked about introspection, the reporting of the conscious mental experiences that we have. So, trying to help us understand what's going on in our own lives. Functionalism. This is kind of born of roughly about the same time as structuralism. What it basically is it believed that mental processes could be best understood in the terms of their adapted purpose and function. And this is kind of from the work of William James. He coined the concept of functionalism, if you can spell that right. He talked about the stream of consciousness that are what we're aware of at any given time is really flowing. And as our thoughts change, that's what our awareness is of that point in time. James was an American. He wrote the first official psychology textbook, so he's kind of given a little notoriety for that. One of his students was Mary Whitton Calkins. She became the first PhD female, but though it was unofficial, she actually studied at Harvard. But for the most part, Harvard did not allow women to go to school there. So she, for the most part, was being tutored. And the cool thing was she outscored all of her male peers on her PhD exam. But because Women were not allowed at Harvard. Her degree, for the most part, wasn't from Harvard. She actually got she could have had a degree through Ratcliffe College, which is Harvard's sister school for women, but she refused a degree on the principle that she really wanted a Harvard degree. Anyway, she became the first president of the American Psychological Association. Um, in time, she's going to be kind of known as the mother of psychology. John Dewey, he was a follower of James. He talked about learning habits, emotion, religion, and teaching. And then Margaret Flo Washburn, she's the woman who gets the first official PhD in psychology, even though Calkins kind of paved the way for that. All right, Gestalt psychology. This is a school of psychology that believed that mental processes could be best understood in terms of their adapted purpose and function. Max Wertheimer, German, he studied visual illusions and ambiguous figures, probably most noted the nectar cube, which we're going to take a look at here in a little bit. One of his colleagues, Wolfgang Kohler, he coined this concept of insight learning. For the most part, insight learning kind of talks about aha experiences, like, now I get it. So he was looking into that. Psychoanalysis. This is getting into focusing on the unconscious mind and its processes. Probably the man who gets probably the most fame for this is Sigmund Freud. Though I will say this, there were others aside from Freud, kind of known as the Neo-Freudians, but we'll talk about them later. He is the founder of this approach. He emphasized the unconscious process of the mind, certainly was very influential in psychology for years, but he was kind of an opponent of Wilhelm Wundt. And they, for the most part, fought about what should be in that definition of what makes up psychology. Behavioralism. This is a school of psychology that sought to make psychology an objective science, to deal only with the observable events and behaviors. So we got to talk about John B. Watson. He's known as one of the founders. He wanted psychology to be truly an objective science based on observations. Ivan Pavlov kind of is the guy who opened the door for this through his experiments with dogs. Though he was a physiologist, he wasn't really a psychologist. I think his influence might sometimes be debated whether or not he's really the father of behavioralism. And then along that line, you got to talk about B.F. Skinner. Though he was not into classical conditioning, such as Watson and Pavlov, he did talk about operant conditioning, the use of rewards and punishment, and the concept of reinforcement. Reinforcement can be for positive things, and it can be done in a negative way. Negative not necessarily being bad, negative meaning taking things away to get the behavior that you want. All right, I mentioned that we were going to talk about the nectar cube. And the question is, what is the nectar cube? Nectar cube is an illusion. This kind of goes back to our Gestalt psychologist. It's all about the change of perspective of the mind and multi-perspectives. And who invented it? This goes back to a man named Louis Nectar. The key here is to look at the dot. And it all depends on your matter of perspective. It might look at times that when you're focusing on the dot, that the yellow square there is actually either the interior of the box, or it could look like that it is actually the wall in the back. So it all depends on how you're looking at this. A lot of times when you blink your eye, you can go from looking at it from one perspective to the next perspective. All right. Thank you very much.